Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really opening up some foundational material. We're looking into the narratives of recovery, specifically those stories in experience, strength, and hope.
hmm
These are, those incredibly powerful personal stories, the case histories that were originally in the big book. They were there to show that this transformation, which seemed almost impossible, was actually happening.
Absolutely. And our mission today really is to get beyond just the history
Yeah.
and pull out the message that still resonates, the message embedded in what these pioneers went through.
Right.
These stories, they really give us the anatomy of a profound human transformation. We want to understand, what were the actual steps they took? What were those universal principles that helped them break through denial, escape that crushing isolation, and ultimately find a life with purpose?
Yeah.
For anyone out there grappling with that feeling of powerlessness, these narratives are kind of like a map. They show the path from impossibility to, well, reality.
Exactly. And that was their original function, wasn't it? Back when the big book first came out in 1939. These 30 stories, they weren't just anecdotes, they were proof.
Hard evidence.
Hard evidence, yeah.
Yeah.
Designed to create that identification for readers who felt totally alone, completely unique in their suffering, hopeless. They showed, like you said, that the virtually impossible had become possible.
Mhm.
And if we look closely, I mean really closely at these accounts, you can trace the exact emotional steps, the spiritual shifts that led to such a radical change. Okay, so let's unpack this journey. Where does it start? Well, nearly every single story in experience, strength, and hope, it really begins at the same place: acceptance.
That moment of acceptance. Chuck C's story, A New Pair of Glasses, it's kind of the classic example, isn't it? He really nails that the whole recovery process only kicks off when someone can finally fully acknowledge and accept just how deep the problem runs. But that acceptance,
Hmm.
it's so tough because of denial. And what's fascinating in these early stories is just how complex that denial was.
Right.
These pioneers, they weren't just sort of unaware. They were, in a way, masters of self-deception. It went way beyond just hiding a bottle.
Oh, yeah.
It was this deep internal conflict. Sometimes they genuinely believed, that it would be selfish to even want something better for themselves.
Yes.
Or they were consciously using alcohol to just numb the pain of denying what they really felt deep down.
And the rationalizations.
Oh, incredible. The sources talk about letter-perfect excuses, constantly blaming things outside themselves.
My spouse drinks too much, or the pressure at work is unbearable, or, all my friends drink like this. Maybe worse.
Exactly. And they'd cling to those early days when drinking maybe did feel good or helpful. One person talks about how alcohol initially seemed to bring me to life.
Yeah, I remember that one. Helping them get through social situations, right?
Gave them confidence, maybe helped them get through a date or a party, able to talk. But that initial relief, it's like a Trojan horse, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because denial also shows up as this really entrenched arrogance, this belief that they could handle it, that they could drink like a gentleman, Right. or that their bad behavior was purely because of external stress.
They just couldn't connect the dots for years, could they? Between the internal misery and the substance itself?
No. It took some of them decades to see that the thing they thought was a crutch had actually cast this oppressive 30-year shadow over everything.
Wow. 30 years.
Yeah. The person who thought alcohol helped them lower their inhibitions eventually realized they just needed it to function, just to get through the day. And their system, it just kept demanding more.
And that physical side, the tolerance changes. That must have been terrifying, even if they tried to ignore it.
It was alarming. One pioneer mentions noticing that, while they liked drinking with people initially, they soon realized their own system seemed to need more alcohol than theirs.
Oh, interesting.
Looking back, they could see they were becoming more physically sensitive to and losing my tolerance for alcohol. The mind was obsessed, yeah, but the body was also starting to betray them, breaking down.
So the obsession and the physical reaction.
Precisely. And this is where you needed something powerful to break through. It needed both science, in a way, and something spiritual to deliver that necessary shock, that sledgehammer, as some called it,
Right.
to shatter that ego, that carefully constructed denial. They needed a couple of hard truths. The first really came from medicine, from Dr. Silkworth, his great insight.
Defining it not as a moral failing.
Exactly, but as an illness, specifically an obsession of the mind coupled with an allergy of the body.
Let's pause there, because that duality, that's the intellectual piece that really shifted things, wasn't it? How did they actually integrate that clinical diagnosis with, their spiritual need or crisis?
Well, that double-edged truth, as Bill W. called it, was revolutionary. It meant alcoholism wasn't just a bad habit, it was potentially terminal if you didn't treat it. The obsession meant your own mind would trick you,
Yeah.
guaranteed. It would make you forget the pain and convince you somehow that this time would be different. You could drink again.
And the allergy.
The allergy meant that the moment you took that first drink, your body would react violently, uncontrollably, disastrously. It was a fatal combination.
So Bill W. understood this.
He grasped it completely. And he used this double-edged truth when he first met Dr. Bob. He wasn't preaching at him. He was sharing a diagnosis based on his own lived experience.
And that personal connection, that shared experience backed by a medical reality, that's what finally cut through Dr. Bob's own defenses, right? His reaction is quoted so often.
And for very good reason. He said Bill W. was the first living human with whom I had ever talked who knew what he was talking about in regard to alcoholism from actual experience.
Wow, it wasn't theory anymore.
No, it was identification. Real gut-level identification, finally supported by something that sounded like science. And that understanding, that identification, it leads directly to step one.
Admitting powerlessness over alcohol, that lives had become unmanageable.
Right. And the sources frame this as the ultimate surrender of self-will. The absolute core message of recovery starts with realizing profoundly, you are not God.
That's blunt.
It is. But the insight was that every single problem stemmed from trying to play God, from claiming those godlike powers, especially the power of control over themselves, over the substance, over others.
Right.
The alcoholic, in the end, has to accept they're not infinite, not absolute, and definitely not in control even of himself.
That must have been just terrifying, but also maybe freeing in a strange way. That moment, the ego just collapses.
It had to be. I remember one story. An individual finally goes to a doctor, is totally honest, and asks, is there a cure? And the doctor just looks at him and says, Pat, for you, there isn't any cure.
Oof. Rock bottom.
That was rock bottom. Only then, when every human solution had failed, did they sincerely, honestly turn to something greater than themselves for help. That utter desperation, it seems, had to come before freedom. So once they hit that internal bottom, realized their powerlessness, the very next challenge was tackling the isolation, that profound sense of being alone.
Which addiction thrives on, right? Secrecy, shame.
Exactly. Addictive behavior loves the shadows. It's sealed off by shame, by fear, by keeping everything hidden. So the next massive hurdle for these pioneers was finding a way out of that self-imposed prison cell.
And the stories about hiding, they're just incredible, aren't they? The level of detail about the extreme measures they took.
Oh, absolutely.
The constant secrecy, the fear of being found out. You hear these accounts, especially from women back then, hiding bottles all over the house, secretly adding booze to coffee or soda.
Behaviors they described as completely foreign to the way I had been raised, just adding layers of shame.
Or the false bravado stuff, like tossing the mini bottles out the car window just before pulling into the driveway. That little thrill of defiance and power in the secrecy itself.
But that secrecy, it wasn't just internal, was it? It was driven by how the world saw them. The sources are clear.
Mm-hmm.
In the 1930s, the public often viewed a suffering alcoholic as a modern-day leper.
Just total judgment.
Merciless judgment. They were constantly told their problems were entirely their own fault, even when they felt driven by these inner compulsions they had no sustained control over. And that shame just pushed them further into isolation.
So the early fellowship, AA, it had to be this radical counterforce, didn't it? A place where all that societal shame and judgment just stopped at the door.
It was absolutely a refuge.
Yeah.
But how did they actually do that? How did they build that connection in those very early, fragile days?
Good question.
Well, the first meetings in Akron and New York, they were like little laboratories for connection. It was a real mixed bunch.
Oh?
Initially, there was a strong influence from the Oxford group's spiritual ideas.
Right, that was the precursor in some ways.
Exactly. Mixed with these desperate, struggling alcoholics. And maybe at first the sharing was just practical stuff, information, but it evolved really quickly.
How so?
They started sharing everything, their current hopes and fears, their joys and resentments. They were basically inventing a new vocabulary, a language of complete honesty and self-reflection, maybe for the first time in their lives.
Wow.
And this deep sharing, crucially without judgment, led to what they started calling Christian fellowship. It was revolutionary simply because it was the first place they could be totally brutally honest without being kicked out or condemned.
And the idea of a sponsor grew right out of that need, didn't it? That practical, life-saving need for support. It wasn't just casual advice.
Oh, not at all. The original concept of sponsorship was intense. It was a serious commitment, almost like active guardianship.
Really? How did it work?
Well, The idea was a sober AA member would agree to sponsor someone who was still sick.
Hmm.
And it was incredibly hands-on. It meant actually taking the person to the hospital for detox, visiting them regularly while they were there, being physically present when they were discharged, taking them home,
Wow.
and then immediately introducing them to other sober alcoholics. It was like this intensive bubble of support through those critical first weeks and months.
That level of physical presence, that spiritual intimacy, coming out of total isolation, that must have been just overwhelming in a good way.
Absolutely. Think about Dr. Bob's approach. He didn't just talk at the newcomer.
Right, the story about him kneeling.
Exactly. Kneeling down with the newcomer, their knees actually touching and offering this beautiful prayer for the person's success. The newcomer later said it made a terrific impression, instantly unforgettable.
It showed partnership, right? Not hierarchy.
Immediate spiritual partnership. And Dr. Bob also gave this really crucial definition of sobriety to that newcomer. It wasn't about being cured forever. It focused on the daily practice.
What did he say again?
He said something like, so long as I'm thinking now, and so long as I'm doing the things I'm doing now, I don't believe I'll ever take another drink.
Ah, okay, so it's conditional.
Highly conditional. It wasn't a promise of permanent sobriety. It was an insistence that staying sober required continuous mental and spiritual action every single day.
And that conditionality, so long as I'm thinking and doing, that perfectly highlights the difference between just stopping the behavior, being dry, and actually having that internal transformation, being sober.
It's a critical distinction and a painful one. They learned the hard way. One of the pioneers talks about staying dry for almost a year just through willpower, maybe after getting really sick. They thought they'd licked liquor.
But they hadn't really changed inside.
Exactly. And then all of a sudden things were worse than ever.
That's the dry hangover, isn't it? Let's dig into that because it's such a core concept. Why would things be worse if you've stopped drinking? What does that feel like?
The dry hangover, or dry drunk, it's the emotional reality when the substance is gone. But all the underlying issues, the self-centeredness, the fear, the resentment, the psychological knots are still there, completely untreated.
So the ego's still in charge.
The ego is still running the show, absolutely, but now it doesn't have its anesthetic. And the result is this state of intense irritability, maybe grandiosity, definitely profound anxiety, magnified resentments. The sources call it being emotionally bankrupt.
Right.
The person isn't drinking, but their whole personality is still wired for selfishness, for being defensive, for demanding the world meet their needs. It proves that real sobriety demands way more than just not picking up a drink. It requires that deep personality change, that spiritual awakening that only comes from actually working the principles.
Okay, so if the dry hangover shows that just stopping isn't the answer, where did these early folks find that fundamental internal shift? Where do the stories point us?
They point us directly into the really tough but absolutely essential work of the inventory process, steps 4 and 5. The founders, they realized that their defective relationships, their crippling self-centered fear, these are the immediate root causes of their suffering, which included their alcoholism. So digging into that internal landscape became, as they put it, the most valuable field of exploration.
And step 4 is defined as that searching and fearless moral inventory. It sounds intense.
It is. It's meant to be ruthless, actually. It's
Yeah.
not just jotting down a few regrets. The language they use is vigorous and painstaking effort.
To do what exactly?
To uncover your liabilities, your character defects, to see how maybe natural desires for security, for connection, for status had gotten twisted into these unhealthy deformities, and to really look squarely at the unhappiness you caused, both to other people and to yourself. It's like an archaeological dig through your own emotional wreckage.
And I imagine that's where people really want to bail out.
Oh, absolutely. The resistance is huge. The internal obstacles are massive.
Yeah.
Just overwhelming guilt, deep shame, confusion, and always that temptation to just take the easy way out.
Let's just forget the past and move on.
Exactly. Or telling yourself, it's just too painful to think about how I've hurt people, hurt myself. But the source material, these stories, they're adamant. Without that dedicated, honest effort to really discover those erosional deformities, those character defects, you can't expect lasting sobriety or any real contentment.
Which leads right into the healing part, step 5. Admitting the exact nature of our wrongs to God, to ourselves, and crucially to another human being. Now, this act of confession, it's framed in a really interesting way, not like modern therapy necessarily, but as an ancient discipline. Why was admitting it all to another person seen as so absolutely non-negotiable?
Because, according to their experience, without that fearless admission to another human,
Mm.
very few people could actually stay sober. The secrets themselves, the weight of that unworthiness, they just festered.
Yeah.
They remain toxic.
Oh, okay.
So confession, sharing it out loud with someone who wouldn't judge, that's what finally breaks the back of that deep internal isolation.
And the results they describe are pretty profound, aren't they?
Often immediate and profound. Step 5 marks the beginning of what they called true kinship with man and God. That crushing sense of isolation starts to lift. You start to gain real honesty, real realism about yourself.
Because someone else heard the worst and didn't run away.
Exactly. When they experience that non-critical acceptance from another person, usually their sponsor, the pioneer could finally start to accept themselves, maybe for the first time ever, and begin to let go of all that crippling guilt and remorse they'd carried for so long.
We mentioned the woman's perspective on this earlier, didn't we? It really captures the fear and then the relief.
It does. She talks about being terrified before her 5th step, just thinking, what on earth is this person going to think of me when they hear all this?
Yeah.
But then when she finally did it, poured out all her secrets and all, the feeling was just tremendous relief. She realized the judgment she'd built up in her head just wasn't there. And that external acceptance from her sponsor paved the way for internal self-acceptance. It was like walking out of an internal prison.
And that whole process, that honesty and acceptance, it fundamentally shifts you towards humility, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Humility, in this recovery context, it isn't about being humiliated or wallowing in shame. It's about having the ability to look at yourself honestly and accept what you find, the good, the bad, all of it.
And that concept, humility, it became so central. It's basically the foundation of the whole movement structure, right?
Yeah.
Through anonymity.
Yes, anonymity, especially at the public level, press, radio, films, is explicitly described as the spiritual foundation of all our traditions
Why spiritual foundation?
because it demonstrates real humility at work. It's a constant reminder for every member to place principles before personalities.
So protecting the movement from individual egos was seen as critical for survival.
Absolutely critical. It was like a necessary firewall against that very human promoter instinct, the desire for fame or recognition. If the focus ever shifted away from the principles and onto the personalities of the leaders, the whole thing would become incredibly vulnerable. Imagine if famous AA stars or messiahs started representing the organization publicly.
Yeah, what happens if they slip?
Exactly. If even one of them publicly got drunk or was lured into using AA's name for his own purposes, the damage, the public shame, the cynicism it would create, it could be irreparable.
So insisting on anonymity at that public level.
It ensured that principles would have to come before personalities without exception. It protects the life-saving message from the inevitable flaws and fallibility of the human messengers.
Okay, so that intense internal work, the honesty, the humility, the confession, it sets the stage for moving outward, right, into the action steps, 8, 9, and 12.
Exactly. The focus makes a fundamental shift here. You move from examining the internal wreckage to taking external action. It's what the founders called the ultimate demonstration of recovery taking hold.
Step 8 is that preparation phase, making a list.
Right. Making a detailed list of all the people you had harmed, and then crucially, becoming willing to make amends to them all. The list part is sort of mechanical, maybe, but the willingness, that's the spiritual shift.
And that marks the real desire for emotional freedom.
It really does. Because it starts when you become truly aware of your part in all the relational messes of the past. You start shedding that victim mentality.
But the sources are really careful here, aren't they? They warn against just rushing into amends without checking your motives, especially around steps 8 and 9.
Very strong cautions there. Particularly, they noted, for women at that time, it was important to do a deep dive into motivation.
Asking yourself, am I apologizing because I genuinely owe this person an apology for harm I caused? Or am I maybe trying to manipulate a difficult relationship?
Right. Am I taking the blame, hoping for a specific reaction, like getting back together, or trying to control the situation by playing the martyr?
Those hidden motives, they can just add to the wreckage, can't they?
Absolutely. The pioneers understood that if your motive is secretly about seeking praise or demanding forgiveness or trying to engineer a particular outcome, the amend isn't clean. It can actually cause more harm.
So the amend has to be offered freely.
Freely, with no strings attached,
Yeah.
no expectation of anything in return. It has to be about cleaning up your side of the street, period. Not about controlling how the other person reacts or what happens next.
Okay, So once the list is made, the motives are as pure as you can get them. Then step 9 is about actually making those direct amends. And that requires a whole bunch of virtues.
It really does. The source mentions good judgment, timing, courage, and prudence. Prudence is key.
Why prudence specifically?
Prudence is that careful judgment you need to make sure your attempt to make things right doesn't actually cause more injury either to the person you're apologizing to or maybe even to other people indirectly. Sometimes a direct amend isn't the right or safe thing to do.
So the steps work together, building this new way of relating to people.
Exactly. They provide this proven path, a way of life where the alcoholic actively corrects past mistakes, makes restitution where possible, and fundamentally shifts from self-absorption to taking responsibility in relationships.
And once that internal and external clearing starts happening, the long-term goal comes into view, doesn't it? Carrying the message, step 12.
That's the ultimate aim defined in their thinking, full integration back into life.
It's not just about staying sober in a bubble. It's about, as they put it, trying again to become citizens of the world that we rejected and of the world that once rejected us. What does that really mean, becoming a citizen of the world again?
It means finding your proper place, your purpose. The real proof of recovery, the ultimate demonstration, is using that connection you've hopefully found with a higher consciousness or a power greater than yourself to find genuine, lasting purpose in life.
And service is key to that purpose.
Service is vital. It's ongoing, non-negotiable. It means using whatever you have, your time, your experience, your hands, your feet, your newfound willingness to help other people, especially other alcoholics.
And in doing that
work, you discover, as one source says, that there is more available to me than I realized before. You shift from being a taker to being a contributor. You find your value in giving back.
And this whole philosophy, attraction, not promotion, humility, service, it got tested really early on, didn't it? With money struggles.
Oh, that historical anecdote is so important. It really cemented their spiritual focus, ironically.
Tell us about that again, Rockefeller.
Right. The founders, Bill W. and Dr. Bob and the early group, they naturally hoped for significant funding. Millions, maybe, to really spread the word professionally. They even met with John D. Rockefeller Jr.
Who was impressed.
Immensely impressed, apparently. Deeply interested in what they were doing. But he declined to give them major funding.
Why?
His reasoning is profound. He basically said that because AA was a work of pure goodwill, just one person carrying the message freely to the next, then little or no money would be required.
Wow, imagine hearing that when you're desperate for cash. Their spirits must have just plummeted.
They reportedly did. It must have felt devastating at the time, like a spiritual compliment that left your pockets empty.
Yeah.
But in hindsight, being forced to accept that collective poverty, as they called it, turned out to be the movement's salvation.
How so?
It kept AA absolutely laser-focused on self-support through member contributions and on attraction, just one alcoholic helping another freely. It prevented them from becoming just another professional organization relying on big external donors.
It kept the spiritual core protected from money influence.
Exactly. It guaranteed that the spiritual element, the heart of it, remained distinct and wasn't compromised by the material demands or expectations of the outside world.
And that attraction model, built on sincerity and anonymity, it actually worked better than promotion might have anyway.
It worked incredibly well. That sense of integrity, that lack of professional pushiness, it actually created immense respect, even in the public sphere. Cynical newspaper reporters often became huge supporters, friends, even zealots for AA.
Because it felt authentic.
Precisely. And that's the enduring strength you see in these stories, from experience, strength, and hope. It all comes down to this simple, shared desire of members, then and now, all over the world, to share their suffering and the steps taken to gain and maintain recovery with anyone else who needs it. They proved, didn't they, that vulnerability and service were far more powerful engines for transformation than money or fame could ever be.
So wrapping this up, what's the core takeaway for you, the listener, today? These early stories, the ones collected in experience, strength, and hope, they lay out a clear path. Transformation isn't instant.
Yeah.
It requires that really ruthless honesty in looking at yourself, breaking free from that crippling isolation by sharing vulnerable with others, and then committing to a life of ongoing service and humility.
Then that really raises a challenging point for us today, doesn't it? In our modern world, everything is about speed, convenience.
Instant fixes, instant gratification.
Exactly. But these pioneers, their experience screams the opposite. That deep internal freedom, the kind that actually changes your personality and gives you back a sense of purpose. Well, it comes through painstaking effort. It comes through ongoing self-examination and spiritual practice.
So maybe the final thought to leave you with is this. Realizing that the kind of profound internal freedom, the serenity these pioneers found, it doesn't come from shortcuts. It doesn't come fast.
No, it comes through submitting to that spiritual discipline day in and day out. They really show us that the highs worth having are worth working for.
That's powerful. The highs worth having are worth working for.
Absolutely. That internal architecture of recovery, it just requires the willingness to keep working those principles every day, accepting that progress is usually gradual and that the spiritual journey is really one of persistence, patience, and maybe above all, humility in action.
It's that willingness to do the deep, honest work that ultimately guarantees the transformation. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into that incredible connection between the individual struggle and the enduring spiritual solution that shines through in these pioneering stories.